Dune. The Waters of Canley. By Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. 1. From the Lost Years of Gurney Halleck. Blood is thicker than water. Water is more precious than spice. Revenge is most precious of all. Songs of Gurney Halleck. The bally set strings thrummed and the flywheel spun, producing a sad song, as it always did. Gurney Halleck used the multi-pick, focused on the music that came from his beloved instrument, immersed in the mood, the sorrow, the anger. With the music, he didn't need to think about the crackling dry air, the rock-walled caves of the smuggler's hideout, the grief that had set deeply into his bones, still undiminished even after a full year. Harkonnen forces had swept into the Atreide stronghold in Arrakeen as soon as the household shields were dropped, thanks to an as-yet unidentified traitor, no doubt someone trusted, and deadly. Gurney was convinced that person was the she-witch Jessica, and because of her, Duke Leto was dead. Young Master Paul was dead, too, as was the loyal Duncan Idaho, a master fighter like Gurney. And so, if reports were to be believed, was Jessica herself. After the Harkonnens had once again taken over Arrakis, the planet commonly known as Dune, Gurney Halleck was the only surviving Atreides lieutenant, he and 73 other men. The Atreides Mentat, Thufir Hawat, had been captured alive and was now forced to serve the vile Baron Harkonnen. Only Gurney and his men remained free, and they spoke often of seeking revenge. But it was difficult and long delayed. He let the emotions flow as he sang a sad refrain. A man of his people, not of himself. Duke Leto betrayed, oh how can it be? Of all the nobles, why our gallant Duke? I shall never forget, shall never forgive. Gurney looked up as a shadow fell over him, cast by the light of the glow globes suspended near the rock ceiling. A burly man stood a head taller than Gurney with blocky features that looked as if they had been carved from lava rock by an inexpert sculptor who had imbibed too much spice beer. Orbo was one of the reliable smugglers who had served their leader Stauben Took for years, a muscular man who excelled in physical endurance and strength, but was never called upon to do much thinking. Gurney kept playing absently, though his singing faltered into silence as he saw the angry expression on Orbo's face. The large group sat inside the rock-walled assembly hall of the smugglers' hideout, their improvised siege in the deep desert. The natural caves had been cut deeper with heavy equipment, the living chambers outfitted to look like the cabins and piloting deck of a spice freighter. Many of Gurney's men were in the assembly room playing gambling games, talking about their long-lost homes on Caladan, describing their prowess with women from bygone days. Few discussed business, because Stauben Took was the one who determined the time and the place of their raids, and his smugglers followed his orders. Gurney's fingers stilled on the bally set strings. Orbo's face rippled with uneasiness and anger, as he seemed to be having difficulty articulating what was upsetting him. Don't you have a fondness for music, man? Gurney asked. He realized that the big muscular man had often shown discomfort whenever he played and sang. Oh, I like music all right, Orbo said in a voice thick from a lifetime of breathing and speaking dust. I just don't like your music. I want happy music, joyful music. He scowled. Your songs have too much anger, too much revenge. Gurney's eyes narrowed. This man was treading on dangerous ground and could get hurt for doing so, no matter his size. Perhaps vengeance is the most important I have to sing about, after what House Harkonnen did. Orbo shook his head. We are smugglers and have no time for politics. You are dangerous. With the palm of his hand Gurney stopped the flywheel spinning. When my men and I joined you, I swore to Stauben I would delay my revenge and find an appropriate way, but I never promised to forget about it entirely. His voice hitched, but he clamped down on his emotions. Thinking about revenge keeps me going. Orbo seized the bally set, snatching it right out of his hands. Gurney grabbed for it, but the big man swung the old instrument and drove it hard against the heat-smoothed stone wall. He smashed the instrument, causing it to make a discordant jangle, like ghosts of the saddest songs ever sung. With an angry grunt, He tossed the string-tangled splinters in a heap at Gurney's feet. Now you don't have music either, and we can finally have peace. At another time, Gurney would have murdered him on the spot. He tightened his jaw, making the ink vines scar their ripple and dance like a purplish dying snake. Several of the other Atreid's survivors rose to their feet, casting deadly glances toward Orbo as he stalked off. Gurney raised a hand, stopping them. He quelled his own anger, walling it off into a safe internal compartment, as he'd been doing since that terrible night. Stauben Took emerged from a small side chamber he used as an office, his expression dark. First looking at the departing Orbo and then at the wrecked instrument on the floor, he asked, "What have you done now, Gurney Halleck?" Gurney struggled to control himself. "Everything in its time, and there is a time for everything. As I sit here with my prized possession ruined, your first thought is to ask me what I've done?" "Yes, I do." He glanced at the tunnel where Orbo had vanished. "That man doesn't have the imagination to be cruel. You must have done something to irritate him. Seriously irritate him." Gurney twitched his fingers as if he could still play an imaginary bally set. "Apparently some of your men don't like sad songs." The smuggler leader snorted. "None of us do. And we're growing pretty tired of you." His expression softened and he gave a hint of a smile to mitigate his words. "You obsess on the defeat of your house Atreides rather than victories to come. You and your men are smugglers now and should be thinking of raiding spice, developing black markets, and stealing equipment from the Harkonnens to sell back to them at exorbitant prices." Stauben shook his head. "The past is the past. And remember what I told you when you first came to me after the fall of Arrakeen, when you were burned and dirty, weak and starving. The same night your own father was murdered by the Harkonnen monsters," Gurney said. Stauben twitched, but narrowed his gaze and focused his words. "I gave you a home, but I warned you not to seek revenge too soon, bringing down the anger of our new planetary masters, House Harkonnen. As my father said, a stone is heavy and the sand is weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than both." "I remember the quote," Gurney muttered, "but I prefer another from Esmar Took." He smiled, softening the features on his lumpy face. "There's more than one way to destroy a foe." He kicked the jangling wires and debris of his bally set as if it meant nothing to him. Compared to his plans, the lost instrument was indeed a trivial thing. Revenge against the Harkonnens, against the loathsome acting Governor Beast Rabban, was paramount. "I've been pondering something in the Orange Catholic Bible. A thinking man has infinite options, but a reactive man is doomed to only one path. You always have a quote. One for every occasion, it seems. Now what the hell does that one mean?" "It means I have an idea about how to hurt Rabban, one that should also prove profitable for us." Took was intrigued. "I much prefer this line of thinking. Tell me." Gurney brushed himself off and walked with the smuggler leader back to his office, speaking in a low voice. "Regular shipments of supplies and equipment come from off-world to Rabban's garrisoned city of Carthag. The beast should not be entitled to all of them." He paused, letting the idea sink in. He could see the thoughts churning on Stauben's face. "First," Gurney continued, "we have to arrange a meeting with the Emperor's unofficial ambassador to the smugglers. 2. As far as Gurney was concerned, this was not a man to be trusted. Count Casimir Fenring was a weasel-faced, dithering imperialist who held a great deal of power. Apparently, Fenring had been a childhood friend of the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. They had shared many schemes and violent adventures, and according to rumor had even assassinated Shaddam's father, placing the crown prince on the throne. On the surface, Fenring had the ability to seem innocuous and foppish, with a meandering conversational style, yet he had a gaze like a pair of surgical needles. This was a deadly killer and the Emperor's proxy on Arrakis. Gurney knew well, he was not a man to be underestimated, and might even have been involved in the plot to destroy House Atreides. Fenring had come to Carthag on official business, to meet with Glossu Rabban and ensure that after a full year the Harkonnen spice harvesting operations were producing the expected amounts of the valuable melange, found only in the deep deserts of this planet. Count Fenring had countless unofficial dealings on the Emperor's behalf, of which neither the Harkonnens nor the Landsraad nobles knew anything. Because of his illicit interactions with smuggler bands such as Stauben Tux, he held the whispered, unofficial title of ambassador to the smugglers. Carthag, a brassy and blustery new city thrown together with prefabricated buildings and no finesse, was a place of dark alleys and sharp corners where Harkonnen troops held as much power over the populace as they could grab, a city where happiness was a rare and expensive commodity. Through his connections among the merchants and military quartermasters in Carthag, Stauben had slipped Count Fenring a message, and the Count had arranged this meeting in an airlocked bar down a side alley, where the price of water was more expensive than any exotic or extravagant alcoholic drink. The proprietor had paid substantial bribes to Harkonnen guards and officials to ensure that this low-profile drinking establishment remained unharassed. The patrons allowed a small measure of privacy. Gurney and Stauben wore dusty desert robes, and Gurney kept a still-suit mask across his face and a cowl around his head, while Stauben was more brash, confident that no one would recognize him, or at least no one would care. Eerie warbling Samuda music played in the background. Incense wafted pinkish clouds of aroma into the stuffy air. All manner of dusty, dirty patrons filled the bar, many of whom were engaged in whispered conversations, as if they were plotting something illegal. A man entered through the door seal, and Gurney recognized Fenring, the imperial representative, a man with secrets and goals of his own. He wore traditional local garb without Harkonnen military markings, drab and dusty folds of cloth, a breathing mask across his face, but he didn't seem to belong here. At first Gurney thought that Fenring, with his fine upbringing and noble ways, was just uncomfortable in a seedy place like this, but realized as Fenring's close-set eyes flashed that this wasn't the case at all. No, the part of Fenring that didn't belong was an act. At any moment he could glide into the shadows with a dagger or other weapon and do exactly what needed to be done, without flinching or the slightest remorse. Stauben signaled him with a subtle hand gesture, and Fenring glided over with a jouncy step. He sat on a hard chair, removed his head covering. Gurney and Stauben already had their drinks, diluted spice beers. Fenring lifted a finger as the surly, wrung-out waitress came up to him. "Ah, I would like water please." Purified water of course, but with a splash of citrus flavoring. "Let's make it special tonight for this meeting, Water," she said. "I'll see if I can find something to add taste." Though Stauben had requested the meeting, Fenring took charge, leaning over the table, glancing at Gurney without recognition but focusing his piercing gaze on the smuggler leader. "I have come to oversee Governor Rabban's activities here. I fear he will not do well, We hope that is the case," Gurney muttered. Fenring suddenly paid attention to him. They had met previously, a brief occasion when Gurney was with Duke Leto, but the Count showed no indication of knowing this. Still, something seemed to be nagging at him, tickling his memory. "Interesting, Stauben sucked in a breath and interrupted. "We don't care who the planetary governor is, so long as we are able to perform our own work, unmolested. And that is why I do business with you, my dear Stauben," Fenring said. For all the good intentions, or bad, of the new Harkonnen overlords, the Padishah Emperor does not like a bottleneck in the flow of spice, nor does he care for a single disreputable source of melange. Imperial governors are so notoriously, unreliable. After all, look what happened to poor Duke Atreides, Gurney felt a flush of angry heat through his skin, took a deep breath for courage. He reached up and removed the nostril plugs, the covering over his mouth, slid down the cowl to expose the prominent inkvine scar on his cheek, the scar that Rabban himself had inflicted upon him after the horrible rape and beating he had committed against Gurney's sister, right before his very eyes. Yes, look what happened to the Atreides. Look what happened to my Duke. He waited a beat as Fenring studied him, worked through his thoughts and memories, tried to recognize who Gurney was. You are one of the Duke's men. A well-known one, He pursed his lips. Ah yes, Halleck, isn't it? Gurney Halleck. Most unfortunate what happened to your Duke, yes, most unfortunate, indeed. And I'm not surprised some of the Duke's men survived, though I am surprised that you would fall in among the smugglers. I had few choices, Gurney answered in a growl. He sipped his diluted spice beer, and the waitress shuffled over with Fenring's water. It looked murky from some oily additive. Fenring sipped, grimaced, but thanked the waitress anyway. The Atreides fell, and it was not entirely due to the Harkonnens. There was treachery. Gurney leaned over the table. Was it treachery from the Emperor? Fenring looked astonished by the suggestion. Stauben reacted with alarm, said, he didn't mean that, sir. The Count glared at Gurney. I assure you, that the Emperor takes no part in the petty squabbles of Landsraad nobles. Gurney rested his elbows on the table. Then we must have been imagining things when we fought enemies in Harkonnen livery who were quite clearly trained as Sardaukar. Fenring paused for a moment too long before saying, then the Baron must have hired some mercenaries with excellent training. Gurney didn't believe him for a moment, but let the matter drop. Fenring knew something, though he probably was not involved in the planning. As a minimum, he and the Emperor looked the other way and let the Harkonnens commit their treachery. He took a deep calming breath. That assessment wasn't his focus right now. Politics and politics, he said, and damn it all to the seven hells. I know who the traitor was, Jessica, the concubine of my beloved Duke, the woman who shared his bed, the mother of, his voice hitched. The mother of Paul Atreides, dear Paul. All of them gone now. He drew a deep breath, felt his face flush. There must be an accounting against the Harkonnens, sir. His voice was hard and determined, and across the table from him Fenring's eyes bored into his, like a laser cutter. Even before House Atreides moved to this damned desert planet, we knew there was a plot. We knew the Duke's enemies had gathered against him. Duke Leto Atreides formally declared Canley on the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. There are rules and expectations to that ancient blood feud. Gurney waited a beat. And now I insist on my right. Sir, on behalf of my fallen house and my noble Duke, I demand satisfaction. Fenring's eyes lit up, and a sardonic smile curled at the edges of his mouth. He sat back, took another unconscious sip of the murky water. Yes, rules, Rules. I demand that the forms be obeyed. But, Duke Leto is dead now, Fenring pointed out. As is his son and heir Paul. I know. And when all the lights go out, darkness only wins until another flame lights the shadows. I am the Duke's last remaining lieutenant. I claim the right of Canley. I will finish this battle against House Harkonnen, in my own way. Fenring let out a long and weary sigh and drained half of his water in one gulp. Vows of revenge are so tedious, so boring to me. Is that why you brought me here? Stauben quickly broke in, looking uneasy. My companion focuses too much on revenge and forgets the more relevant part of this discussion. He has developed a plan of action, a fascinating one, I think you'll agree. The Harkonnens supply Rabban's military outpost in Carthag with off-world water, shipped from their homeworld, GD Prime. The water costs little, although the transportation is expensive. A supply tanker of water, enough to fulfill the extravagant needs of the Harkonnen troops, arrives each month. To the people on GD Prime, it is mere water, practically free. To the people of Arrakis, it is a treasure worth more than spice. For some it is worth more than life itself. We intend to hijack the tanker and take the water, Gurney interrupted, catching Fenring's attention again. We need to enlist your assistance, your connections, Count Fenring. We require access to the Guild hayliner. When it arrives, we need to know the crew and defenses aboard the Harkonnen tanker when it's still up in orbit. Once we get aboard, we'll handle the rest. Stauben interjected, stealing that tanker will be a great embarrassment for Rabban, and thus Gurney gets his revenge and can declare Canley complete. And we smugglers receive a water prize worth a huge amount of Solaris here on Arrakis. Fenring sounded dubious. And why would I assist you in this? What possible reason would I have? Gurney chose to state the matter flat out. Because we will pay you an enormous bribe. Stauben looked as if he had just swallowed sand, and choked on it. Fenring did not laugh, nor dismiss the suggestion. And the guild itself will require tremendous payments, He tapped his fingers on the tabletop. I admit there is a measure of amusement in placing Rabban in an awkward position. It is never good to have a planetary governor who grows too complacent. Giving him a black eye could be very beneficial. Gurney nodded and unknotted his fists on the table. We will pay the inducement. We will round up additional spice, and you will have the funds you need. I haven't even quoted the price yet, You may find it overwhelming. We will pay it, Gurney said, and Stauben glared at him. Fenring's eyes narrowed, flicking back and forth as he performed calculations in his mind. Gurney was reminded of how Thufir Hawat had concentrated with remarkable focus and intensity when he performed mentat projections. Then Fenring quoted an amount so astronomical that Stauben gasped and looked at him in disbelief. Gurney had made calculations of his own, knowing the smugglers and the Atreides fighters would find ways to gather extra spice in their raids, perhaps with the cooperation of desert villagers, maybe even the freemen. We will pay it, Gurney said again. 3. It was not difficult to rally the desert villagers and the freemen against the Harkonnens. Gurney had known it wouldn't be. He knew Beast Rabban. Less than a week after their secret meeting with Fenring, smuggler scouts and spice hunters on the edge of the desert plateau spotted a black flag of smoke curling up from the elbow of a canyon, the site of one of the hardscrabble Graben villages. A squalid town that collected droplets of moisture from the air with huge skimmers and condensers, people who coaxed useful minerals and metals from the rocks and scavenged just enough spice from the open desert to trade in the cities for supplies and medicines they needed, and no luxuries. The smoke had wafted up, dissipating for hours before a spotter reported it. After checking the weather report and verifying there were no sandstorms or turbulent cyclones on the flight path, Gurney flew the low-altitude ornithopter. Beside him, a concerned-looking Orbo rode, along with Stauben and 10 other armed smugglers in seats at the back, all clad in desert gear. Even after being stranded here for a year in the smuggler crew, Gurney still found it awkward to prepare for combat without a personal shield, but no one on Arrakis wore a shield. Not only did the sand and dust make the devices malfunction, the pulsing field effect would invariably attract and madden a giant sandworm. No amount of personal protection was worth the risk of facing a monster like that. Gruff Orbo looked through the thopter's scratched and pitted Plaw's window as Gurney flew in toward the smoke. Once or twice he had considered challenging the bigger man to a duel, to slay him in front of the other smugglers for the insult of smashing the bally set. The smuggler caves were without music now, and Gurney found them a much sadder, lonelier place. But he knew that if he challenged Orbo, who had many friends among the smugglers, he would damage his own standing in the group. Even if he won the duel, he would have to leave. Gurney didn't want that, couldn't afford it. He needed these hardened smugglers, especially now that he was so close to achieving what he wanted so badly. He had not forgiven Orbo, but gave the matter no further thought now, blocking it away like putting it inside a walled fortress. He did not allow the incident to fester within him the way the thought of Rabban did. The way the traitor Jessica festered within him. I know what that place is, Orbo said, pointing down at the surface. The rattling hum of the engine and flutter of the articulated wings nearly drowned out his voice. Gurney looked to the side, through the window past Orbo. What is it? What's out there? Orbo simply stared out the window. Just behind Gurney, Stauben leaned close. His village is out there. He came from the desert people and joined us. Sometimes we bring water and supplies to that settlement. As Gurney flew in, he realized with a sinking sensation what the curling smoke meant. Looks like someone else found it, too. Orbo just stared gloomily. He'd already figured this out himself. The smugglers were greatly uneasy as Gurney brought the thopter around the high cliffs and into the elbow canyon. Black starbursts of explosions marked the desert floor and cliff walls. The once huddled buildings of the small outpost had been smashed and burned. Bodies lay sprawled in the streets, their skin blackened, some of their desert stillsuits still smoldering as slow-burning fires ate through the sandwiched fabric and cooked the dead flesh underneath. Gurney had barely landed the thopter when Orbo cracked open the door and burst out, his boots sinking into the stirred gravel and sand. He didn't even affix his nose plugs or breathing mask. He bounded forward, letting out primal sounds as the other smugglers followed. Gurney shut down the rotors, racked the articulated wings into their resting position, then joined Stauben outside. While Orbo and the smugglers searched the mangled remnants of huts, the low dwellings built into cliff walls, and the supply sheds that had been leveled with explosives, frantically looking for survivors, Gurney knew they would find none. Rabin would not have left any. Orbo came back, his face distraught. Soot smeared his cheeks and desert cloak. Other smugglers had dragged out the bodies of dead villagers, laying them out on the bleak canyon floor. Who did this? Orbo sobbed. Why? You know who did it, Gurney said. Perhaps your people didn't pay Rabin the tithes he demanded, or maybe his men were just bored. No survivors? Stauben asked. They're all dead. He wanted to burn everything so no one would find this village at all. A single sandstorm can wipe out the rest of the evidence. Rabin doesn't care about any evidence he leaves behind, Gurney said. He's perfectly happy to let you find it. Dozens of other villages in the Pan and Graben have suffered the same fate in the past year. Rabin needs to make everyone fear him. He clenched his jaw. Any fool would know this is wasteful, not leadership. When he glanced up, he caught a flicker of movement in the cliffs, in the shadows of rock, while a human figure, darted into a cleft. As Gurney watched, a camouflage cloak swirled up and he could no longer see the person. Freeman, Stauben muttered. Gurney was intrigued. An eyewitness, maybe? More likely just drawn to the smoke to investigate, and to scavenge what he can. Gurney looked down at the bodies lined up outside the village, recalling a rumor he'd heard that Freeman took dead bodies and extracted the water from their flesh. Yes, water was indeed a precious commodity here. If Gurney and the smugglers hadn't flown in, maybe the Freeman would have stolen the bodies so that no one knew what happened to them. He looked around at the cliffs, saw no further movement, could no longer see a hint of where the furtive Freeman had vanished. He suspected others were also watching, camouflaged as well. They would be listening. Gurney looked at Orbo, then at the smuggler leader, and spoke loudly. Stauben, this is the time for revenge. You have made me wait too long. Now Orbo's village is destroyed, his entire family. Stauben, your father is also dead because of the Harkonnens. He raised his voice to a shout, and all you Freemen, I know you're listening. Spread the word among your sieches. Tell the desert people in the Graben villages and those hidden in the deepest wilds that we need a huge amount of spice, not for our own profit, but to make the proper bribes. Tell them we have a way to hurt the beast who did this. Gurney knew if his words resonated here, the message would spread. The survivors and bereaved from other villages Rabin had preyed upon, those people would help him. He wasn't the only one with justification for a vendetta. So much blood had been spilled that the cost in spice was not even worth measuring. They had 3 weeks to raise the enormous amount of melange before Count Fenring returned. They would get more than they needed in 2. 4. 12 men, all loyal, tried and true Atreides veterans for the mission. Gurney selected them himself and disappointed others back in the smuggler's hideout, because every one of his men who had survived Arrakeen still served the memory of their beloved Duke Leto and his family, and wanted to share in Gurney Halleck's quest to meet the requirements of Canley. They all wanted to shed Harkonnen blood, but he could only take a small number on the mission up to the Guild hayliner, where they would steal Rabban's water tanker. A dozen men following him, and Gurney didn't promise they would survive. He merely told them they might, and might not die. Brave and dedicated men, that was good enough for them. For House Atreides. They called out in a cheer, joined by the other Atreides men who had failed to make the cut. Staubentook then insisted that Gurney also take 6 of his original smugglers to ensure his own profit as well as Gurney's vengeance. Orbo led this smaller group, but they would follow Gurney's orders to complete his plan. The squad traveled surreptitiously to the battle-damaged spaceport at Arrakeen, much smaller than the large industrial platforms in Rabban's city of Carthag. Following the attack a year ago, using modern weapons and old-style artillery, the Harkonnen invaders had damaged much of the Arrakeen spaceport, and although it had been patched and repaired to make it serviceable, no one had bothered to clean up all the battle debris, not thinking it mattered. That's how the Harkonnens were, and Carthag was their capital here, while Arrakeen was just a sad and painful memory of the all-too-brief Atreides rule. Gurney wanted to depart from the Arrakeen spaceport for a purpose, though. He despised Carthag and the pigsty stink of Harkonnens there. The frontier town of Arrakeen was more familiar to him, and more appropriate for the purpose of Canley. The forms must be obeyed, he thought. By his reaction, Count Fenring had obviously been surprised to receive the enormous spice bribe he'd demanded. The amount was so exorbitant he'd never imagined that even the largest smuggling crew could achieve it, but he accepted the shipment with good grace and no questions. In return, he provided the vital information Gurney had requested: guild access cards, stolen uniforms, codes and schedules, basics that the raid required. Gurney had led his own men into battle many times. They were well versed in Atreides code language, and would follow his orders instantly and efficiently. They understood his tactics instinctively, and never questioned an order in the slightest degree. He spent more of his time discussing the plan with Orbo and Stauben's men, all of whom gruffly acknowledged his instructions. They could smell profit and the adrenaline rush of adventure. The thought of seizing an entire Harkonnen tanker filled with water destined for Rabban's troops filled them with excitement and anticipation. Back on Caladan, Gurney had often listened to half-drunk men in dockside taverns sharing preposterous stories about great fish they had nearly caught out on the sea, but had gotten away. The water tanker would be like that in Gurney's secret plan, unrevealed to them or to anyone else. His plan within a plan. This big fish would get away, or it would seem to do so. The men were silent, huddled with excitement and wrapped in desert clothes like refugees as they rode together in the rumbling liner that lifted off from the Arrakeen spaceport. The guild pilot asked no questions of his passengers, merely acknowledged that their documents were correct and their passage was paid for, along with the additional bribe Gurney had paid to him, to ensure the man's best work. Few workers were able to buy their way off the desert planet, particularly now that Rabban had clamped down on veteran spice crews in order to increase production, but Gurney had found a way to circumvent the system. The Duke's man knew that all necessary details were in order. Staubentook had enough connections to make it so. The only questionable part about their disguises, he realized, was that these men were intent and grim, and any workers truly escaping from a ruckus would be celebrating. But none of his team could find it within their hearts to fake that part, even though it had been suggested. The lighter was an old model ship with few amenities. Gurney gripped the armrests of his worn seat, holding himself against violent tremors as the craft heaved itself out of the planet's gravity well like an old man rising roughly to his feet. Through thick Plaw's portholes he could see the cracked scab of the desert dwindling below, smeared and softened by a haze of high, orangish dust. He turned his gaze upward to where the sky darkened and the atmosphere thinned toward space and the huge guild hayliner waited for them. His pulse raced. Plans and memories collided in his mind, and his fingers twitched involuntarily, as if playing the strings of an imaginary bally set. His men muttered to one another, pretending to make idle conversation but listening to few of the words. An island in their midst, Gurney focused his thoughts forward, reviewing each step they would take once they reached the huge ship. The hayliner's enormous hold carried countless separated vessels on docking cradles. A guild navigator would fold space and transport the immense ship from star system to star system, stopping along the way so that smaller ships could disembark and fly to their destinations. But first, Gurney had something to do. The lighter rising from Arakeen reached orbit less than an hour after the huge hayliner arrived. Gurney had complete confidence in Fenring's information, but he also had every reason not to trust the man. Visionaries and fools feed themselves on optimism, not bread. Even so, Gurney thought he could rely on Fenring to get them inside the big vessel. After that, he would count on nothing but the skill, dedication, and courage of his best men. The lighter came aboard the huge ship, maneuvered into the central hold as the great bay doors opened and the administration work took place, with guild officials accounting for all arriving craft, assigning docking cradles, finishing documentation so that the outbound vessels could depart for Arrakis. According to Fenring, the bribe to the guild was enough for them to bureaucratically stall the release of Rabban's water tanker. "We won't have much time," Gurney said to his men, repeating what he'd told them earlier. Orbo held his hands in front of his face, palms facing and fingers curled, as if he were thinking of strangling a succession of enemies. He had been murderously gloomy ever since seeing the massacre of his village by Rabban's troops. The lighter docked, its slender form clicking into the clamp, and the egress tube deployed from the hayliner wall, connecting to the main hatch of the lighter. Gurney motioned to his men that it was time. When the hatch opened, he led his team through the connecting tube, shucking their dusty and tattered desert cloaks along the way because they would not need them again. Beneath their traditional clothes, they wore the guild uniforms Fenring had obtained. Gurney had used makeup over the inkvine scar on his face, but his lumpy features and characteristic rolling gait could never be concealed from anyone familiar with him. Gurney intended to kill any Harkonnen who showed the slightest inkling of recognizing him. And if they didn't show any such sign, he would still kill them, though perhaps not so quickly. Fortunately for him, many guildsmen also had imperfect features. He felt comfortable on their huge ship, he was fitting in well. Once away from the lighter, Gurney consulted the detailed schematic of the vessel that Fenring and the guild had provided. His men had to work their way through the inner hold decks of the hayliner to find the Harkonnen water tanker, a trivial ship among the thousands of vessels carried by this enormous transport. Inside the sandwiched hold decks they rode tube transports, sitting alongside silent guildsmen who showed no interest in their presence. Gurney's squad traveled along the hull, rising up the curve, counting decks until they reached the appropriate sector that contained the docking clamp holding the water tanker. Gurney and the uniformed men carried packs, toolkits, diagnostics, and false documents showing that they had been sent to inspect the manifest of the Harkonnen transport. All perfectly routine. Gurney knew none of the Harkonnen crew would be suspicious because they were arrogant. His men also carried packs with hidden weapons, knives and mala pistols as well as personal shields, which were never used down in the desert, but Gurney insisted on them here. This would be his kind of fight, and on his terms, his own retaliatory sneak attack. Gurney also had a special surprise inside his pack, something required by the Canley he intended to administer. His men were subdued and intense, their eyes shining and deep blue from frequent consumption of the spice melange. This distinctive tint might have been problematic, except guildsmen also imbibed spice heavily. In all likelihood no one would question the coloration, at least not before his team had their chance. Gurney felt a rush of relief as they came upon the access ramp assigned to the Harkonnen water tanker. Gurney used his access cards, having no choice except to hope Fenring and his guild allies had deflected the previously assigned guild inspection teams, leaving the way open for him and his crew. As a matter of practice, the Spacing Guild did not involve themselves in petty family feuds, especially not something so small as a single water tanker, and certainly not an outburst from the last remnants of a fallen noble house of the Landsraad. House Atreides was irrelevant to them, but it was not irrelevant to Gurney or to any of his men. Stauben's 6 smugglers were efficient enough and businesslike, but the Atreides men were on a higher level, more intense. Orbo almost had that, impressing Gurney a bit, but not causing him to let down his guard. He recalled something the assassinated Duke Leto had said to him once, that an enemy can be anywhere, declared or undeclared. At the end of the ramp, the hatch opened to the tanker, and they boarded through the lower deck. Inside, a surly-looking engineer stood with arms crossed over his wide chest, a frown on his face. The griffin symbol and the colors of House Harkonnen drove a knot into Gurney's stomach, but he maintained a neutral expression. "About damn time," the engineer said. "We need to depart within the hour. Do your inspections and sign off on the paperwork. We'll be faster if you leave us to our own work," Gurney said. "All right, go about it, then," said the Harkonnen engineer. "I have enough of my own damn work trying to take this load down to Carthag. The captain says there's been a security alert on the hayliner, and we've all had to do nonsense drills. I don't have time to show you around anyway." Gurney felt a chill, and his men flicked glances at one another. One twitched toward his pack and the weapons hidden there, but Gurney made a subtle gesture to calm him. "We'll be efficient," he said. "I just need to see your cargo hold, and these men will verify your atmospheric engines." Showing impatience, the engineer pointed them in various directions for the inspections. "Security alert, Gurney?" muttered one of his men, as soon as the engineer was out of earshot. "Do you think we've been betrayed?" "There's always a chance of that, but I've heard that security alerts are commonplace on hayliners. This is a fresh crew. Did you see the water fat on his face? He's never been to Arrakis before." The other man grumbled, "No appreciation for water, that's for sure." Gurney nodded. "All to our advantage. Now go." The men split up, going about their guild inspection duties. Their uniforms made them invisible to the Harkonnen crew. Gurney hoped they didn't have to begin killing before it was time, or that could alert others. Fenring had instructed Gurney not to make any move until the water tanker dropped out of the hayliner's hold and was free of guild jurisdiction. He had made the importance of that eminently clear. Acting his part as chief cargo inspector, Gurney made his way to the lower bulkhead that sealed the bulbous compartment holding a large bubble of water from GD Prime, a place where such a substance was as unremarkable as air, a shipment that cost the Baron Harkonnen almost nothing, yet was worth an incredible treasure here on Arrakis. Plaw's observation ports providing them with views into the cargo hold showed only murky liquid, but Gurney knew its potential, its worth. This water represented revenge to him. Canley. It represented hope and death. A smile twitched across his face. He found an access port for drawing samples and testing the water, but from the look of things Gurney doubted the tanker captain had ever bothered to do this himself. These Harkonnens did not yet have an appreciation for the value of water on the driest, most desolate planet in the universe. He unshouldered his pack and got to work, doing his secret thing, the thing that even his most trusted followers did not know about. When it was done, Gurney stared at the precious cargo behind the Plaw's observation window, but he thirsted for something else. 5. It was easy enough to fool the tanker's systems. Playing their role as guild functionaries, Gurney and his men verified the craft's engines, acknowledged the cargo of water, signed off on the tanker's departure from the hayliner. An hour later, after most of the other Arrakis-bound ships had already dropped from their docking cradles and descended to the desert planet, the water tanker was at last cleared. The guild inspectors departed through the access tube into the main ship again, at least that was what the records showed, and the tanker captain received authorization to depart. But after Gurney and his team supposedly left the access tube, 2 of his men remained behind, hidden on the engineering deck, where they could divert the sensors on the sealed door. When clear, they let the fighters back in, and they rushed to take hiding places among the engine blocks and cooling racks. Gurney knew it was an inelegant hiding place, but they needed only 10 minutes before the tanker dropped out of the hayliner and began its spiral toward the desert planet on course to Carthag. Huddled in the dark and noisy lower decks, they heard the thump and felt the jarring vibration through the hull as the tanker drifted free. Slow suspensor engines guided it carefully among the other stowed vessels within the guild ship's hold, then the tanker dropped out into open space over the desert planet. The more powerful engines ignited, driving it down toward Arrakis. Gurney's heart raced as if he had taken a heavy dose of stimulants. Revenge was his stimulant. All of his men felt the same. Orbo's hooded brow shaded his gleaming eyes, and he continued to strangle imaginary foes. Concealing himself among the conduits and cooling tubes, Gurney held his breath, counting silently as the tanker dropped away from the hayliner. When he knew it was safe, Gurney gestured to his team. They attached their shield belts, clipping them into place but not activating them yet. After he closed his eyes and breathed a prayer, he raised a hand, and his men surged out of their places of concealment. They moved out, knowing their one goal was to reach the piloting deck and seize control of the tanker. According to Fenring, only 7 Harkonnen crew would be on the bridge, 4 more down in engineering, and 2 more in other duties around the tanker. Gurney had enough fighters to overrun them, and he had the element of surprise. The impatient engineer was the first man they encountered. "You're not supposed to be." One of the smugglers fired a Mala pistol, and the projectile ripped through the engineer's chest. The boom of the spring-wound weapon was loud, but mostly drowned out by engine noise. Another engineer shouted, calling for help. Gurney ran straight at him, holding his knife in one hand. He preferred to use the more personal touch of death, because this was a very personal matter. He bounded ahead as the astonished second engineer turned to flee, grabbed the man by the collar of his overalls, yanked him backward, and swiftly drew the blade across his throat, spilling blood across the deck. Gurney realized he had lived on Arrakis for a long time, because his first thought was not to savor victory, but to frown at the waste of viable water gurgling out of the man's severed arteries. The attacking squad rolled forward, independent but efficient, focused on the same goal. They easily found 2 other workers on the engineering deck and slew them without fanfare. Gurney motioned for the team to follow him to the piloting deck. They hammered up metal staircases, passed through bulkhead doors. One sleepy man emerged from cramped crew quarters, calling out a question more than an alarm. His mouth was still open when Orbo grabbed him by the hair, yanked his head back hard enough to snap his neck, and threw him with disgust down to the deck. "1 level up," Orbo said. "That's where we'll find the controls." Gurney and his men ran and burst through the hatch, charging onto the piloting deck, with him and 2 Atreides fighters in the lead. The bulkhead door created a bottleneck, and only 3 could pass through at a time, but he saw instantly what he had feared. Instead of the tiny crew Fenring had reported on the bridge, 20 armed Harkonnen soldiers faced them. Alarms had begun to ring throughout the tanker, despite their attempts at swiftness and caution. As Orbo and 2 more fighters crowded through the bulkhead doorway, one of the smugglers called out, "We've been betrayed. This is too many. Not too many for us to fight." Gurney activated his personal shield. The other men did the same. With a roar, Orbo pushed past them, lumbering across the deck and throwing Harkonnen fighters from side to side. "Use your shield, man," Gurney said. "Don't need a shield," Orbo replied and crashed into 2 armed guards, grabbing them and smashing their heads together. He turned to fight 2 more, but they opened fire, cutting him to pieces. Lurching forward, the big smuggler managed to collapse on top of them, knocking the Harkonnens down as more Atreides fighters rushed onto the piloting deck. The Harkonnens had advanced weapons, but Gurney's team fought like madmen. The pilot continued to work the controls, hunched over the console and glancing nervously from side to side as the battle continued around him. "We're outnumbered, Gurney," one of his men shouted. "But we'll fight to the death. For House Atreides." The others picked up the defiant cheer. For House Atreides. Gurney slashed the throat of another man and glanced around the deck, looking for any additional threats. Fenring had provided a schematic of the tanker so he could see the waterhold and the engineering deck. He had also noted a large escape pod on the starboard side of the bridge. He had his own plan, one his men didn't know about. The Atreides men fought furiously. They had already lost so much with the assassination of their duke, and now they were willing to pay with their lives for Canley, for Gurney's revenge, but it belonged to them as well. They had no need for regrets. So far they had killed 5 of the Harkonnens, losing Orbo, 1 other original smuggler, and 2 of his Atreides men. Then the secondary door to the piloting deck opened and 10 more armed Harkonnen soldiers appeared. A cry of despair rippled through his team, particularly Stauben's smugglers. "This is not what we were promised." "We were not promised anything," Gurney said, "just given information we hoped would be reliable. Will you whine and snivel, or will you fight?" "For House Atreides." His men shouted, and their fierce response drove the Harkonnen guards back, but at the loss of more of Gurney's men. Shot in the chest, one of his men still managed to reach the pilot, shooting him through the head with a Mala pistol. The pilot slumped and fell aside while the injured Atreides man shoved the bleeding body away to work the controls. The tanker lurched as Gurney's man changed their course, heading down through the rough atmosphere. Thin winds and veils of dust screeched and buffeted against the hull. Another Harkonnen guard killed the Atreides man at the piloting controls, and the tanker careened out of control. The Harkonnens had managed to transmit a distress signal, calling for assistance, and Gurney had no doubt that Harkonnen fighters were already streaking upward from the military base in Carthag. He didn't have enough time, and was losing too many men. They had put up enough of a fight, no one would doubt their intent. Yet the full measure of his revenge required the next step, his secret plan. "We cannot win, and I will not let us all die." To the escape pod. Fighting furiously, the team reacted with dismay. "I die for House of Atreides," one of his men vowed. "It is not necessary." Gurney ran to the starboard side of the piloting deck. "Come, all of you, to the escape pod. Join me." A Harkonnen guard lunged at him, and Gurney blocked him with his activated, shimmering body shield. His foe moved slowly, trying to penetrate the intangible barrier, but Gurney brought his knife into the man's gut, driving it deep, twisting, finding the abdominal artery and severing it. The man bled out within seconds, but Gurney held onto the body like another shield, backing toward the pod's hatch. He activated it with a backhanded swat. "With me. You'll die if you stay here. Harkonnen ships are coming. But we can't just leave." One of his men yelled. "We will, I command it. We've shaken them, and we'll fight elsewhere." Gurney dragged the dead Harkonnen guard, who was limp in his arms. Letting go, he fell backward into the large escape pod, and his reluctant men tumbled in after him, crowding into the interior chamber. The last ones continued to fight, and 3 more of Gurney's team fell, 3 more he would have to add to the verses of his sad victory song. The water tanker roared and rattled through the atmosphere, dropping through the sky as Gurney sealed the pod, trying to stabilize the flight. Just before the escape craft disengaged, Gurney could feel the larger ship under control again. The tanker would indeed fly into Carthag as planned, its decimated crew shaken. Rabban would declare it a victory. "Now!" Gurney yelled, releasing his control over the water tanker. The escape pod released, bursting out into the winds and flying to a dangerously low altitude. The clunky vessel had minimal guidance, but he hoped the Harkonnen pursuit thopters racing up from the industrial military city below would be more interested in saving the tanker and its valuable cargo. Gurney controlled the pod as best he could, sending out a coded signal to Stauben Took, asking the smugglers to intercept them wherever they crashed out in the desert. He prayed he could guide the pod close enough to the rocks to avoid being devoured by a sandworm before they could be saved. The 5 surviving men with him were injured and needed medical attention. He sat hunched over his knees. The makeup covering his ink-vine scar had flaked away under beads of perspiration. He thought of his sister raped and murdered by Beast Rabban, thought of Duke Leto and dear Master Paul. He had done this for them, and would remember that when he counted his loyal dead. 6. In the smuggler's siege hidden in the deep desert, the mood was a stew of somberness mixed with anger. As the Harkonnen air defenses swooped in to intercept and escort the battered tanker, Gurney's escape pod tumbled off into the desert. Well away from the tanker, smuggler ships retrieved Gurney's pod just in time by darting into the canyons and hiding in the rock shadows as a ruthless desert storm built in the atmosphere. The Harkonnens had found the crashed escape pod, but none of the smugglers, and then the storm had driven them back to Carthag. In the tunnels, Stabentuk's glare was like a fusillade of weapons fire directed at Gurney. But Gurney held on to hope as if it were a lifeline. The dead had been counted after the raid, and the smugglers were dismayed at the loss of 13 fighters, their bodies left behind in the clutches of the Harkonnen animals. Gurney was sickened by that. Of the 12, 9 loyal Atreides men had been slain and 4 of the original smugglers, but they'd known full well what they were fighting for. None of them would have any regrets. He felt sadness for Orbo, even though the man had been surly and smashed Gurney's bolly set, stealing music from the smuggler hideout just as smugglers stole spice from the Harkonnens. In his life, Gurney had held numerous grudges, but this was not one of them. He understood Orbo, and appreciated him now for his courage. The big man had died fighting Harkonnens, and he'd exacted his own vengeance. Gurney only wished he could have seen the rest of the plan. "I shall write a song for them," Gurney said aloud, lost in his thoughts. One verse for Orbo and his men, and another for the Duke's brave men. All will be remembered. Staben's face reddened, his eyes narrowed. The smuggler leader lurched out of his alcove cave office. "Remembered, Gurney Halleck? Not a one among us would forget. The raid was a failure. The Harkonnens fought better than expected." He came forward and thrust a finger in front of Gurney's face. "What I did not expect was for you to be such a coward." "We were outnumbered and getting killed," Gurney said. "We couldn't have survived, and it took skill and courage to bring the survivors home. You should have fought harder, should have fought longer. We lost good men, some of my best. Thanks to you and your foolish plan, we spent half a year of profits on the spice bribe for Count Fenring and the guild." He drew a deep breath, as if he could barely phrase his own disgust. "And you lost the water. Everything. I never believed you would give up so easily. The great Gurney Halleck. I thought all your fury and passion was wrapped up in this scheme. You retreated too soon. I've heard the reports on you." Gurney thought of the battle, of the armed Harkonnen guards on the piloting deck. "No man among us is ashamed at how he fought. We killed many. Man for man, their losses were twice ours. But our losses count more," Staben said. "Now I have to find more men to replace the ones we lost." The smuggler leader sounded exhausted. He shook his head as he reiterated, "And you lost all the water." Gurney's anger boiled. He had held it inside for too long, not just about how the raid ended, but the long simmering poison of everything that had gone wrong, the treachery since the moment that fighting first broke out on the terrible night in Arrakeen a year ago. "I didn't want the water," he confessed in a husky voice. "I wanted revenge. I wanted Canley." He departed, leaving Staben looking confused. Back in the escape pod he found the uniform from the last Harkonnen guard he had killed. It lay folded and cleaned as he had instructed, the knife tear in the belly repaired. He shook out the fabric, inspected it. Now he had everything he needed. He had to get back to Carthag, and he had to hurry. 7. The uniform fit well enough, though he despised the markings and the fact that others might look at him and consider him a Harkonnen. But the disguise was necessary. Thanks to the repressive mood that Rabin engendered among his loyal troops as well as the downtrodden people who worked the new garrison city, few people would ask questions. Gurney would use their own suspicions and fears against them. He would use Rabin against himself. Carthag was on high alert after the attempted hijacking of the water tanker. The fact that some of the men had called out the name of House Atreides during the raid had set the Harkonnens on even more of an edge, but because the Harkonnens had won, defeating the raiders, they were giddy. Rabin had declared a day of celebration. The water tanker had been brought in under heavy guard, and Rabin made bold announcements about how the smugglers had been thwarted, the last remnants of Atreides fighters shamefully defeated. He had mutilated the bodies of the fallen smugglers, including Gurney's men, for a macabre public spectacle. And when the people of Carthag did not cheer sufficiently, he gave orders for them to do so, and they obeyed. The increased security bound the Harkonnen troops more tightly together in their crackdown on the city people in Carthag, and they never thought to look carefully at one another. Gurney had spent many horrible years on GD Prime under the Harkonnen Bouthiel, and he could speak convincingly to the troops, so that they easily accepted him. The Harkonnen blind spots were evident to him. Gurney adjusted his uniform, but had removed the insignia of the tanker ship so that no one would ask questions. He couldn't stomach the other soldiers congratulating him, and none of the surviving tanker crew members were visible, even on this day of celebration. Yes, Rabin had declared victory and publicly acknowledged the crew for their bravery in driving off the attempt. But Gurney had made subtle inquiries and was not surprised to learn that Rabin had quietly killed them, imposing punishment because they had allowed the dire situation to occur in the first place. Gurney had known Rabin would never remain silent about the victory, about the Atreides loyalists who had been defeated. It pleased him to hear a rumor that the escape pod had crashed and all the remaining smugglers had been killed. It didn't matter how many of the people of Carthag actually believed it. Gurney was perfectly content to let Rabin think that any renegades involved were dead. Gurney savored the anticipation as he walked confidently into the barracks, acknowledging the troops who bothered to look at him. He moved as if he had important orders from Rabin himself, and no one would challenge him. A desert had covered his hair and the side of his face, and his stolen uniform was dust-stained, some of the markings strategically obscured. Now that the tanker was safely arrived, Rabin wanted to demonstrate largesse, to show his appreciation for his troops who had been assigned to this awful planet. In the main barracks assembly hall, he had gathered his men for the event. Gurney had to see this with his own eyes. Someone had to witness his revenge, in the name of his beloved Duke Leto Atreides and all of his men who had died at the hands of the Harkonnens. Gurney slipped from one point to another as if he had a destination, but he just wanted to keep moving, keep watching. The soldiers talked in a low buzz as they sat looking down at their trays of food. Most of the men had removed their nose plugs and face masks inside the barracks, but they still wore their desert gear. At a glance, he could tell which of these soldiers had been on Arrakis for the past year and which were new arrivals. Gurney wanted to see them all dead. They were all Harkonnens. Even the freshest arrivals were not innocent. Rabin's very existence was like abrasive powder in Gurney's arteries, making the center of his chest hurt. The husky man sat at a table raised above the troops so he could look out upon the lines of tables. Rabin had a feast set before him, far more extravagant than the rations of his troops, but the new governor of Arrakis had his own point to make. He did not stand as he raised a crystal goblet in his left hand. We have water, and on Arrakis water is life. Our tanker arrived safely, but it was a very close thing, a near disaster. This planet is dangerous, and there are those who wish to harm our rule. With his other hand he picked up a pitcher of water and poured it into the crystal goblet. Those who tried to steal that tanker would steal our lives, but we stopped them. He slammed the goblet down onto the tabletop, breaking the crystal and spilling water, a stupid, wasteful thing to do on Arrakis. We stopped them. The men cheered. This water is from the tanker we saved. Extra rations for you on this meal, so you know your worth to House Harkonnen. Servants rushed in carrying pitchers, and the soldiers muttered, but this time the buzz seemed less more curious than appreciative. 1 cup apiece from the newly arrived supplies. Those of you who have been with us know the very high value of the reward I give you, the supreme value of water on a ruckus. The soldiers grunted and cheered, and Rabin held up his crystal goblet, waiting as the servants went through the room pouring water. Someone put another goblet on the table next to Rabin, but he put a hand over the top and shook his head. The servant looked astonished. But sir, you don't want any water? Rabin again refused, and the servant surreptitiously poured a goblet for himself and gulped it down. Into his own goblet Rabin poured a pale vintage from a green bottle. I will celebrate with my own reward. Caladan wine. Drink up. He drank deeply from the goblet, while the others consumed their water. Gurney had not expected this, but he didn't show any emotion, and kept moving by the table as if he had a seat to claim or a place to go. He stood off to one side, watching them all. Waiting. Over the next hour Rabin consumed 2 bottles of Caladan wine and demanded that the servants open a third. He got sloppy drunk, and Gurney grew impatient, nervous. Why wasn't he drinking any of the water? It took nearly 90 minutes for the neurotoxin in the water to take effect on the others. Gurney had known it would take this long, but still felt time dilating, dragging out. He feared his presence would be discovered, and knew he needed to leave. Some of the people were noticing him, remarking on how he stood aside and was not drinking the water, not celebrating with them. Now Rabin noticed him from his high table. His wine-bleared gaze locked onto Gurney's angry glare and seemed to see something there, recognizing an ancient memory of pain. Did Rabin even remember what he had done to Gurney's sister so long ago, the rape and murder? And what he had done to Gurney, the scarring with a whip? The inkvine scar burned on his cheek and he was sure the makeup was sloughing off. Rabin hesitated. Suddenly, one of the soldiers groaned loudly and slumped onto the table. Others twisted and spasmed, sliding off their benches to the dusty stone floor. One after another. The Harkonnen troops inside the barracks were beset with paroxysms of pain, vomiting, twitching with their eyes rolled back in their heads. As alarms sounded, medics rushed in, but there was nothing they could do. They had all drunk the water from the tanker that Gurney had poisoned, and he knew there was no antidote. Those with a smaller body mass were affected first, while the heavier ones could only watch in horror, terrified of what was to come within the next few minutes, and it always came. Rabin roused himself enough to bellow for his guards to find the perpetrator, but his protectors, too, were debilitated. Gurney watched them die, one by one and in clusters of screaming pain. By the end of the night, hundreds of Harkonnen troops lay dead, all poisoned from the deadly nerve toxin he had poured through the sample access hatch into the tanker's cargo hold during the supposed guild inspection. Only one taste of a droplet was a fatal dose, and Gurney had added more than a liter to the supply, enough to kill every man, woman and child in Carthag. But Beast Rabin would not share the water with civilians, not with servants, not with merchants or tradesmen. He had only given it to his troops, and they were the ones condemned to death. Canley? Gurney whispered as he watched the men die, slipped out of the barracks before anyone could ask the wrong questions. He remembered how the Harkonnens had conquered Arakeen, not just because they'd enlisted a traitor, or because they'd been in possession of superior weapons, but also because they used archaic and unorthodox weapons, a method of attack that even Thufir Hawat had not anticipated. For the sneak attack on House Atreides, their arch-enemies had brought in artillery, old-fashioned projectile weapons that were normally useless due to the prevalence of shields. Many Atreides soldiers had died that night in Arakeen and in the defensive battery caves in the shield wall, bombarded by artillery projectiles. Duke Leto had said in despair, their simple minds came up with a simple trick. We didn't count on simple tricks. Now Gurney had come up with a simple retaliation of his own. Stauben took, Count Fenring, and the guild representatives had all believed that Gurney's true goal was to steal the water tanker, and that would have achieved a certain measure of revenge. The loss of that water would have placed great hardship on the Arrakis garrison and caused extreme embarrassment for Rabban. But for Gurney, stealing the tanker, or attempting to do so, was merely a diversion. He had never intended to escape with the water because he had poisoned it while aboard the tanker. Because they'd fought so hard and lost men, the Harkonnens would never doubt that the raid was sincere. They simply hadn't had the imagination to figure out what Gurney had really been doing. And he had known from Rabban's past behavior that he would probably attempt to buy the loyalty of his troops with a few sips of water, without knowing it was deadly poison. All those deaths. Rabban would cover it up. He would make excuses to his domineering uncle, and the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen would certainly not believe them. Gurney heaved a deep, satisfied breath, and felt a shudder, not of relief or satisfaction, but of acceptance. He had achieved Canley. If only Rabban himself had imbibed the poisoned water, his revenge would have been sweeter, but this would do for now. For Duke Leto. For young Master Paul. It was not enough, but Gurney Halleck had sent a powerful message. Still wearing his Harkonnen disguise, Gurney slipped out of the Carthag barracks, leaving behind the moans of the dying, along with the alarms and shouting medics. Gurney struggled to conceal the satisfied smile on his face. After this massacre he would leave Carthag and return to the smugglers. But he couldn't depart from the city just yet. He wanted to go into the town, find a merchant and spend some of the money he had brought with him. He needed to buy a new bally set, one that made sweet music to keep the smugglers company in their hideout. Now Gurney had a new song to compose.